Research papers are only one kind of writing that economists do. Economists may also write consulting reports, policy briefs, memos, presentations, and blog posts. But many of the main ideas are consistent across these different types of writing. So the components of an economic research paper and the components of the paper that I will ask you to write for this course are an abstract, an introduction, a literature review, a theoretical framework, an empirical analysis, and a conclusion. So we'll start by talking about the abstract. So the abstract is typically a one paragraph, so around 80 to 100 words, summary of the paper. In the summary, you're going to state what policy you're studying. You're going to summarize the main points of your paper. What were you setting out to do with the analysis that you're going to be discussing in the paper? You can mention the data you use and the empirical findings. I tend to like to do that personally because it gives the reader a stronger hook to get them in to read the introduction. And the abstract should emphasize your contributions to the literature. So don't summarize what other people have done, tell us what you have done. And you can see here in an example from the Andrea van Ukert paper that we did for How to Read a Paper, and will be our running example throughout today, that their abstract follows very much in this formula. After the abstract, there will be an introduction section. And in the introduction, you're going to introduce the topic and state its importance. You're going to try to convince the reader that this paper is worthwhile for them to read. Everyone has finite amounts of time, and there's always a trade-off between reading one more paper and doing something else. You want to make sure that your reader chooses to read your paper instead of doing something else. And so this is your opportunity to do that. And if we look at the introduction of our example paper, they note that the last federal minimum wage increase happened in 2009, and that other states have enacted their own minimum wage laws. The implication here is that there's a lot of policy interest in the minimum wage, so understanding its implications and its impacts might very well be an extremely important question. The next question is to provide the relevant details of the policy you'll be discussing. What is the rationale for it? Why are people doing it? So again, turning to our example paper, the minimum wage is often motivated as a way to improve living standards for low-income people. So you should think about a similar question, a similar issue for your research question. Why are states or actors or people doing this? Why are they enacting paid sick leave laws? Why are we implementing non-pharmaceutical interventions during the COVID-19 pandemic? Things of that sort. There's a whole long list of topics that you can pursue. Next, we want to write out and explain the economic questions that you're going to be addressing. So the idea here is don't leave the reader guessing about what you're going to do. Tell them in the introduction, I am going to address how the minimum wage affects health, right? That's exactly what they do here. They say that the questions of a higher minimum wage will increase well-being of lower income individuals, and they're going to measure or operationalize that using diet and access to healthcare data and things of that nature. So there's sort of two steps here. They've got this broader meta question. Does the minimum wage increase the well-being of lower income people? And then they have the way they operationalize or chose to execute it using data that they happen to have available to them. The next section is the literature review. And in the literature review, you want to try to tell a story. Explain to the reader how what you're doing follows logically and naturally from what people have done before. So again, turning to our example paper, the authors walk through a number of earlier results about the effect of the minimum wage on health outcomes, and they explain, or they use that to explain what is known about the research topic. And you're going to want to do the same thing. So you're going to want to find papers that are relevant to your research topic and try and figure out, well, what's the story? How do they connect to one another? Maybe one paper is responding to another, or maybe they're not necessarily strongly connected, but they all provide different ways to think about the same overall topic. The literature review should also highlight any holes or discrepancies in the previous research. So the idea here is, if there's a hole, if there's something missing, filling it in is going to be a contribution in and of itself. You don't have to do anything beyond that to sort of check off this paper is making a contribution to the literature box. In the case of our example paper, the authors note that the literature is sparse, particularly when it comes to the effect of the minimum wage on investments in health. And there are very good theoretical reasons they talk about later on about why that's the case. And that brings us to our theoretical framework. So the theoretical framework is going to ground all of the analysis that's going to follow in the paper. So in our course, these frameworks are going to be based on economic theory, particularly microeconomic theory. And the goal of the framework is to make predictions about the anticipated effects of the policy so that you can derive predictions that yield testable hypotheses. And so this is really important. A framework that doesn't yield predictions doesn't tell us what will happen in the presence and in the absence of a policy. It doesn't tell us what would happen if we raised the minimum wage or if we lowered it. So you need a framework that's going to allow you to answer that kind of a question. So you can generate these empirically testable hypotheses. Now your framework can be formulated in a bunch of different ways. You can formulate it with graphs and equations, but you can also do it with only text. Oftentimes, you only need text to formulate or explain a theoretical framework. In our example paper, they use text to explain their framework around the expected impact of the minimum wage. They say that on the one hand, the minimum wage is going to increase people's income, and that's naturally going to lead to them to consume more normal goods. On the other hand, if some of this consumption is also time consuming, the minimum wage increases the opportunity cost of consuming those goods. So it's going to decrease consumption of those goods. So in their framework, the interesting question is that there's an ambiguity about how the minimum wage is going to affect consumption. The income effect says more, but substitution effect or the opportunity cost effect says less. And they're really thinking about the balance between those two. After the theoretical framework, there's going to be an empirical analysis. And the goal of this empirical analysis is to test the hypotheses from the theoretical framework. And so in the economic approach, we're going to use data and analytic methods to find evidence that supports or refutes a hypothesis, or test the theoretical predictions from our framework. And because of these considerations, because we're focusing on testing hypotheses and testing these theoretical predictions, we're going to focus on quantitative data and concepts that we can measure numerically, because that's going to allow us to use standard empirical methods. So we'll be able to use methods that I can teach you during the course of the semester to answer real empirical quantitative questions about the effects of public policies. In the empirical analysis, it's also a good idea to carefully describe the data that you're going to be using, carefully describe those data sources. So in our sample paper, they explain that they're using the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, and they explain why they chose to start their time series in 1993, because that was the year when the BRFSS became a national survey. And they also explain the source of their minimum wage data. So you want to be sure that you do the same thing in your paper. You explain what data you're using and why, and then you also explain what other ancillary data you're using that are important and where they come from. So obviously for this paper on the effect of the minimum wage on health, health data from the BRFSS and minimum wage data are really important. You should also explain why your data are appropriate, right? Provide a motivation for these data. So in our example paper, the BRFSS provides them with a large sample of people who could be affected by a minimum wage law. It's a very large survey. They've got a lot of people between 18 or 25 to 64 years of age who could be affected by this minimum wage law. You also need to explain how you worked with or manipulated your data to go from the raw data to a clean data set. And I find it very helpful to write the section explaining what I did with the data alongside any code I use to go from raw to clean data. And I encourage you to, simply you're familiar and comfortable with statistical software packages, to follow that approach. So sit down, open the raw file, write down all the changes you're doing in a code file that you can then replicate and use again in the future. And our example paper is going to explain this process in detail for the steps that they took to construct each variable of interest for their paper. They go through every variable in quite a bit of detail in the paper. Your empirical analysis is also going to result in producing some tables and graphs. Now each table and graph should be numbered and titled, and in many cases you will also need to include footnotes to provide contextual or other information. In this example, you see a table number and title at the top of the page, and then notes at the bottom. And that's very typical for an empirical analysis table. In writing up this analysis, you should also introduce each table or graph. One sentence is often sufficient, and you should note that the order in which tables and graphs are numbered should match the order in which they're introduced. So you want to introduce table 1 before you introduce table 2, before you introduce table 3, and likewise with figures. Figure 1 should be introduced before figure 2, before figure 3. Next, you want to discuss what you observe, what you notice about each table or figure. What are the trends you see? What are those points that are relevant to the economic question you're addressing? How do they support or not support your hypothesis or your research question? And your description of each table or chart should be sufficient to tell the story, tell the core of your story, even if we remove those tables and charts from the paper. And that's always a very tricky balancing act to do, because you don't just want to repeat exactly what's in the table or the figure, but you want to complement it, but in a way that allows the reader to ignore the actual tables and figures if they want to. And finally, you should have a discussion of the implications of those empirical results. Do they support or reject your theoretical predictions? And this is a very important part of any paper, because ultimately, this is where you describe the test that you did. So in our sample paper, we see the introduction of each table or graph and a description of the results. The last part of the paper is a conclusion or a discussion section, and this does not need to be particularly long. It can often be as short as 1 or 2 paragraphs. And here you want to begin by restating your main point or the main purpose of your paper. And this can be done in various ways. In our sample paper, the paper first puts the results into context and then summarizes them briefly. The other important part of your conclusion should be a discussion of the limitations of your results. These limitations may include issues with data, such as potential misreporting, which is what the authors of our sample paper highlight, as well as untested assumptions that are important for your results. Thank you and good luck.